You're listening to the Blue Lies Podcast, where we uncover the truth about America's cops.
Imagine an America without law and order. A mobocracy where the government submits to the demands of domestic terrorists, where criminals are glorified and police are vilified. Imagine an America where good is evil and evil is good, and the fascism our forefathers died to defeat is championed. Sadly, this is our America. Officers' assault in Birmingham posted on social media. Criminals paid in San Francisco for not shooting anyone. Gunman honored by NFL who live-streamed police pursuit and shot at cops. School resource officer fired for her blue line flag. This is just the beginning of the war on justice and America's cops. But one retired cop is speaking out.
I'm Jeff Wolf. I spent 20 years in the law enforcement community, and now I'm standing up for cops. Join me for the next few minutes for the Blue Lies Podcast. My guest today is Mark Wolander. He is a former FBI special agent, a retired assistant U.S. attorney, and an expert on all things law enforcement as far as I'm concerned. I first came to know Mark when I was researching for my book, Blue Lies, and came across a column that he wrote. And when I read his column, it's as if he was reading my mind. So I am delighted and excited to have Mark as my guest today on the second episode of this Blue Lies mini-series. Mark, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Jeff. I was looking forward to this conversation more than you can even imagine.
Well, I appreciate that. It is an honor to have you. Your resume precedes you, your reputation rather precedes you, and obviously you've been in this business for a long time, beginning with the FBI and, of course, moving into federal prosecution. And so you are qualified, more than qualified, probably more qualified than anyone I could talk to discuss some of the topics that I want to throw at you today. I want to talk about this notion that police are a protected class and not held accountable. You and I know that's not true, but there is a generalization that is pushed by the mainstream media mob that American police officers are basically just kind of going out and doing whatever they want, and they're not held accountable. And that's just not true. I mentioned your columns. It was with the State Journal there locally where you are in the Lexington area, I believe. The column was dated September 21st of 2020, right at the end there of the summer of love, if you will. And the column was entitled, "End the War on America's Police Officers." So clearly when I was researching for my book, this article jumped out at me, which is when I first contacted you. I want to just kind of read a couple of lines. I explained to you off camera that I should just read the entire column, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to keep it to just a couple of lines. I do want to read this very first, this second paragraph. Is 4 lines long. You said, "When historians write the pages of American history books about the events of 2020, at least one chapter will likely be dedicated to the unraveling of America as a result of a war on Americans' police officers, a war intended to sow the seeds of unrest intended to change the face of America forever." And that's just the second paragraph. It goes on and gets much better from there. And of course, I'm going to mention here in a moment how you end it. But what drove you? What was the motivating factor for you to write this particular column after this summer of riots back in 2020?
So, Jeff, I think if I was to look at my worldview or my view of what law enforcement is all about, I'd probably have to go back in time and talk about it from two different perspectives. Before we started here today, I started thinking about what has happened in law enforcement today, and I think what the best way to equate it is those of us that know a little bit about World War II, many of us will remember the Battle of Arnhem, and that was described as a bridge too far. And I think that's where we're at today with law enforcement. We've gone a bridge too far. And so that's one perspective that I bring to this. The other perspective is going back to May of 1986. It was the bloodiest day in FBI history. I was an FBI agent, and many will recall, there was a shootout in Miami, Florida, and Jerry Dove and Ben Grogan were killed. And in addition to that, there were 5 other FBI agents that were wounded seriously, and it ended up in a bloody firefight. Well, I knew Jerry Dove. Jerry Dove and I had gone through SWAT training together, and after that firefight was over with, I think a lot of us in law enforcement in the squad rooms, we talk about, what maybe went wrong that day. And I think some of us thought what went wrong is even in 1986, police officers were concerned about whether or not they were going to be second guessed for decisions that they made. And I've looked at the reenactment of that shooting, that bloody day, and I wonder to myself if the FBI even at that time hadn't been second guessing when an agent had to use deadly force. If that hadn't happened, maybe when Jerry and Ben were pulled up alongside of Platt Maddox, maybe they could have ended it before they tried to do a felony stop. And so that goes back a lot of years. But now we fast forward, and when I wrote that article, I was thinking, a moment's hesitation, most people don't realize this, but a moment's hesitation for a police officer, as you well know, could cost either the officer's life or somebody that the officer is trying to protect. And so that's where my mindset was. And I could go on, but I won't. I'll throw it back at you and let you follow up on that. I probably went back too far in history for you.
No, not at all. I happen to be a history buff, which is something you don't know about me. And of course, you and I both know that particular incident with that FBI shootout shaped a lot of law enforcement training going forward. Now, it would be a few more years after that when I got started, but I remember watching the reenactments and learning from that particular incident. The fact that one of the agents that was killed was found with empty brass in his pocket because, of course, we were talking about muscle memory and conditional training and how that, that's how back then they were taught to put the brass in their pocket in training so they wouldn't have to pick all the brass up after their training was over. And that training kicked in, and even in a live, real world live fire event, that was happening. So I remember just from training, learning about and studying that particular incident. So, and as you said, officers being second guessed for their actions to protect their own lives or the lives of someone else. It has been building over a generation with the advent of the everywhere video camera, being the smartphones that we all carry, to the just the outright brass of the media to report and say some of the things that they say, because news is no longer news. News is now opinion. And so that's something that has built to where we are today. I made a comment to my last guest that one of the very first prime time looks that Americans had from their couch of the just sheer raw nature of police work was the Rodney King video. That is a black eye on American law enforcement and will continue to be a black eye on American law enforcement. But that video was filmed with one of those over-the-shoulder home video cameras from across the street, filmed kind of anonymously and came out after the fact, obviously. But now we have evolved a generation later into a society that is so contemptuous of police officers and so contemptuous sometimes of just anyone in authority that you see videos on YouTube literally on a regular basis of someone in a police officer's face with a video camera, i.e. their cell phone, and challenging them as they are engaged in a confrontation with a citizen. whether or not that is justified or unjustified, meaning their confrontation. And so that's where we've come from. We've come from filming across the street to literally challenging the police in their face while an event is happening. And that's why officers, part of the reason why anyway, officers tend to fear that the decision they have literally a split second to make is going to be second guessed. And now it's not just the obvious situations like Rodney King. That was an obvious situation. There was not a whole lot of thought that had to be put into that. What happened to Rodney King was horrible and it was obvious to everyone who watched the video. But now it's not as obvious anymore. Now the videos are cut and edited and placed on the news or social media to display a use of force event in an encapsulated view when, we all know something happened before the video and something happened after the video, and that is not a complete body of evidence that you're looking at, which is important in these use of force situations. So, it's resulted in what we now know to be what one writer called the Ferguson effect. Cops have come to the place where they're just afraid to do anything.
And I think the thing that you add to that is the dynamic of, like you say, you started at Rodney King, and now you're in the technological day and age, right? With a cell phone, everybody has a cell phone. But before the officer even has a chance to go back and write a report, the local news has already written that this officer has accosted this person and done something wrong. And then add to that, another layer that officers have to deal with is they don't get a lot of support sometimes from either the chief of police or internal affairs, and then the politicians come out immediately because they want to avoid not being reelected. I think some of that was happening over in Louisville during the Breonna Taylor shooting. I think Steve Conrad, the chief of police, and I think the mayor, I think they added to the situation. They put officers at risk. And the way they handled the situation was totally different than what how our city handled the situation. So again, officers are in fear of their lives. They're in fear of their jobs. I mean, can you imagine what it costs to defend a case? I mean, and I well know that when you're charged with something, if you don't have insurance and the city's not going to back you, it'll wipe you out.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. Well, we've already gotten ahead of ourselves on this episode of the podcast. It's easy to do because we start following the trail and it kind of splits off into other trails. But let me bring us back to 2020. Again, back to your column before we start talking about some of these cases. I'm going to read the next part that I highlighted here. As long as many in the media continue to turn a blind eye to the violent protests and riots that have become commonplace, and instead label these violent protests and riots as mostly peaceful protests, the war against America's police officers will spread across America like an out-of-control wildfire. And that's exactly what happened. This was written September of 2020, and as we know, those riots continued into 2021 in some cities. And the result has been, of course, in that time, the defund the police movement was in full force, and city councils were actively taking millions of dollars away from their police departments. And as a result of that, crime rates spiked, murder rates went up exponentially, doubling in some major cities. And then what happened was, of course, when the evidence of what all of us, guys like you and me, have been saying all along, that taking away the police is not the issue and defunding the police is not going to solve the problem, some people have to learn the hard way. And unfortunately, communities and innocent people who shed their blood as a result of less police protection had to learn the hard way. And then those same politicians who were decrying defund, disarm, and disband the police began to pull back and say, well, maybe that's not such a good idea, and began to throw money at police. Unfortunately, by the time that started happening, the damage had already been done. And I believe now they realize that that has backfired on them, and that's why so many of our major cities are now throwing more money at the police. But it's a little too late at this point. And so what I don't understand, and even in all of my research for Blue Lies, I don't understand why, as you wrote in your column, that this unrest is being pushed by the media mob and embraced by so many of those that hate the police. Why do we have to go down this road? What is it that people think is going to happen? This leads to nothing, in my opinion, but anarchy and mob rule. And nobody benefits from that situation except for the lawless. And I have some theories, and some of that goes down a different road. But what we've come to in light of all of these things taking place and all of that we've discussed so far is that officers are now being used as sacrificial lambs, in my opinion. And that brings me to one important case that you are very familiar with, and that is the case of a Louisville Metro former police officer, now former police officer, that was just indicted federally for events that occurred during a riot in late 2020 after the Breonna Taylor shooting, in which the officer was with other officers trying to enforce a 9 o'clock curfew during these protests and fired some pepper balls, and it led to them, literally the officers in the National Guard, taking fire from inside a business and then returning fire and killing a man by the name of, I believe his name is David McAtee, a business owner there. So now the officer and the other officers and the National Guard members, the shooting was deemed justified. So now it seems like the aim has been taken against Katie Crew, the former officer who fired the pepper balls at the doorway of this particular business where all of this was occurring, stating that she was doing such in response to a refusal to comply by those she was trying to disperse. And though the shooting was deemed justified and there were no criminal charges brought, now the federal government has decided they're going to indict her for violating the civil rights of someone who refused to go back in the business and comply with a curfew.
Yeah, it's an interesting case. And what's more interesting about it, Jeff, and what fascinates me more than anything when we see these cases that come down from the federal government for civil rights violations is if you look at the date of the actual incident, it was June 1st of 2020. And now here we're almost 18 months later. They've exhausted their ability to charge former officer Cruz. If there were actual charges that would have been out there, they would have been brought in state court because that would have been a state violation. But once that failed, they still had to answer to the press, in essence, and to a lot of the people in the civil rights movement that are anti-police. And I'm not against the civil rights movement. I grew up in a time where the civil rights movement, even to this day, but now she's the victim of this. I don't know what ability she has to hire an attorney or whether or not her former department will pay for the attorney. But you have to take this in the same idea of what would it take for her to be charged in a civil matter. I would imagine that this would be, at least her part of it, it would be thrown out because she'd have qualified immunity. I know you hinted at that before. But if you can't even get a judgment against her because she's got qualified immunity for what she did in the heat of the moment, if you will, and everybody says, you don't look at this in just with tunnel vision. You have to look at it, what was going on. This is like the second or third night of rioting, and I say rioting. Everybody says peaceful protest. It wasn't peaceful protest. It was rioting in Louisville, Kentucky. These officers were put out on line. You had a police chief that basically wouldn't allow them to engage, in essence, who issued the pepper balls? It's a less than deadly force. And so, yes, this lady was shot. She got hit with some of the pepper balls, but I mean, did what she did, what Katie Crew did, was that willful? I don't even know that it fits the definition under criminal jury instructions that they will be able to get a guilty verdict against her. I very candidly, yes, she might have done something wrong. It might have risen to the level where she should have been terminated from the department. But from what I can see from the indictment and the timeline and everything that was going on, I mean, I hope a jury listens carefully to what happens on the street. The other thing that always amazes me about these cases when they get to the federal level is, and I didn't have this problem because I'd been on the streets. A lot of the officers would come to me with cases that they wouldn't take to other people. But, but for the grace of God, has anybody ever been in the middle of a situation where you're faced with that kind of danger? I'm sure we hear another example of that. I'm sure we hear, well, he fired 17 rounds at the person when the shooting started. Well, most lay people don't know that it only takes about 3 seconds to empty a 17-round clip when the shooting starts. Yeah. And the tunnel division kicks in, you're going to fire everything you have in your gun, everything.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
I very candidly, I shouldn't be saying this because it's still pending, but I'm sitting on the sidelines right now and I'm rooting for Katie Crews, and I hope other people are rooting for Katie Crews because it's ridiculous. So what did they do in the case? The indictment says she used unreasonable force. Well, I don't understand, that these two federal prosecutors have even a concept of what unreasonable force is. A pepper ball is less than deadly force. Could they have used beanbags on her? I mean, there's 1,000 other things. How about if we get water cannons and go back to using water cannons during the riots? Or remember the days of Philadelphia when they used horses to move rioting crowds back? People didn't want to get stepped on by horses. So what is it out there? Well, anyways, I probably shouldn't have gotten that emotional about it, but I think what's happened in this case was outrageous. I don't think the federal government did anything more here than try to grab a headline. That's all this is about. Grab a headline and satisfy the people that are calling for blood. So
I agree, and there's it's not necessary to apologize for being emotional because I as well get emotional. I tend to be a pretty dramatic and emotional guy when it comes to what I see as injustice. And again, as you said, this is the heat of the moment kind of thing. Police officers don't just pick up a weapon like a pepper ball gun and somebody tell them, okay, here, you take this and you shoot them toward protesters and it's going to make everybody cough. And, I've been sprayed with pepper spray before. It's not pleasant. I can't imagine pepper balls are going to be that much different than pepper spray. But the fact of the matter is police officers are trained to you in law enforcement. The culture is you have to be trained to use anything. My agency bought a couple of these all-terrain vehicles, these open-air all-terrain vehicles, and you had to be trained before you could drive it. You have to be these little drug test kits that you see on the show Cops and Live PD when we still believed in television like that. When you'd see an officer drop a suspected drug in one of these little capsules and then break it and it would turn it separate. You have to be trained to even do that. Everything in the law enforcement community, you have to be trained to use. I'm surprised they don't make you get trained to use black and blue ink pens because they're different colors. It requires different training. I'm being sarcastic now, but the point is you have to be trained to use any of these things. And so she was trained to use this pepper ball gun. And of course, with anything you're trained to do, there is a policy attached to it. We're not just going to train you to use it. We're going to write a policy that dictates how you can and how you can't use it. And so the reason they fired her, from what I'm reading, is that they are saying that she violated the policy regarding the discharge of the pepper ball gun, in that she was either using it too aggressively, or she was firing it at the individual rather than at the ground as per their policy. I also read that she violated their social media policy and that she made some post about it after the fact, hoping that the pepper ball stung a little bit or something to that effect. And that's another conversation altogether, because I also believe that police officers' First Amendment rights are being taken away. And at the same time, I do believe that as police officers, we have to use a little bit of discretion and not come out and say things that are going to be misrepresented or used against us later when it comes to social media. But the fact of the matter is, does she deserve to be federally indicted and, God forbid, even convicted for actions she took to enforce the law and to comply with her orders? And her orders simply were to enforce the curfew, disperse the crowd. Now, we have come to a place in our country where we believe, or have been led to believe, that personal responsibility doesn't matter anymore. The fact of the matter is, this young lady, as other people, and I've watched the surveillance video, and when the pepper balls start coming, you see all these people in the surveillance video rushing past her in the doorway to get inside away from the pepper ball, while she just continues to stand there in what appears to be a defiant nature. And as the officer said in her report, that she gave clear, constant verbal commands, and this young lady was not complying. Well, there are parameters, right? There are parameters: reasonable suspicion, probable cause, the steps we go through mentally as law enforcement professionals that dictate what our next action may or may not be. And in her summation, she was faced with someone who was not complying with commands, and so she used less than lethal force, a pepper ball gun, to disperse her. When it went south is when this young lady's uncle came out with a handgun and started shooting at cops, and you and I both know that's when the game is over.
That's right.
So it would seem to me that this particular indictment, this is just completely conjecture and opinion on my part. It would seem to me that this indictment is simply a tool being used by the prosecutor to appease those who are raising hell, if you will, about everything else that happened and the shooting and the death of David McAtee. I don't wish death on anybody, but you can't shoot at police or National Guard and expect there not to be consequences, right? And that's what happened.
So let me put another layer on all this too. I have this conversation with my friends all the time, all of my friends in law enforcement, and I would talk about all the cases that I did over the years, 17 years, over 600 cases. And what I see here too is an inability for the supervisor, and I don't know who that is, and I'm not trying to offend them, but I see a supervisor that looked at this indictment and realized that the Civil Rights Division from the Department of Justice was involved in it, and that the U.S. Attorney had opened up the case, and they had done this investigation with the FBI, Internal Affairs from Louisville. What I see here is a supervisor that's not willing to say, no, this doesn't reach the level of what you need to do to take it to a grand jury. Instead, this is a supervisor that says, we'll just throw it at the wall, let the grand jury make a decision, then if we find her not guilty down the road, we can say that we at least did it. When I was in charge of the Drug Enforcement Organized Crime Section at the U.S. Attorney's Office over the years, there were many times when police officers would come in and say, here's what I got, and I'd look at it and go through the evidence, and I'd say, you ain't got enough. Take it back and do a bit more thorough investigation. That's what I see here, too. I mean, again, almost 18 months later, this woman's now got to face a federal jury and exhaust whatever resources she may have or her family might have. And it doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And again, I may be wrong, but I think her biggest sin, and I think you touched on her biggest sin, was her social media post. Because when you look at the social media post, that was after the fact. It wasn't what was in her mind when she was being attacked by that unruly mob. And that's probably a definition that could probably be expanded. But, again, the second night of rioting, third night of rioting, you have people that are confronting them. You have people that are walking up to them and poking them. And, how much do you take? And how much do you have to be in fear of your life before you use the less than deadly force, the less lethal force, and so forth? So again, I think some of this goes right back to, and I think some of it's political. I think the current Department of Justice, Merrick Garland, is just trying to appease the current administration. And I will tell you that it's kind of interesting to me because I noted within the last couple of weeks, the administration has now changed course. And if you read the paper this morning, there was an article in there that they're proposing millions of dollars to be put back in this next year's budget to refund police departments. You know what I say about that? I wouldn't give one of these local communities $1 unless they reinstated all the money they took from them to begin with. And all that you're going to do is you're going to open up the Department of Justice coming in and monitoring the police departments and and that's never worked out. And it just doesn't work out. So there's a lot of layers to this.
There are, and it's difficult to even, deal with this in a short podcast like this. But as you said, the case is still ongoing. It'll be interesting as we follow this particular case to see what happens. Strangely enough, there is a case like this that was happening in 2020. Also, we do kind of know the outcome of to a certain extent, although this case has still not completely been disposed of, and that is the one against Officer Garrett Rolfe of the Atlanta Police Department. I know you're not as familiar with this case as I am, as I researched this particular case for my book, Blue Lies. But in June of 2020, Officer Garrett Rolfe and another Atlanta officer was dispatched to a Wendy's restaurant. I'm sure everyone knows this case, at least by headline, in which they believed that this gentleman, Rayshard Brooks, was intoxicated. Long story short, they have an interaction with him that seems to be cordial and compliant, and all at once things go south, and Mr. Brooks attacks the police officers. He disarms one of them with of his taser and uses a taser against the officers. And this confrontation ended in Officer Rolfe firing and shooting and killing Rayshard Brooks. And of course, that created a mass protest turned violent riot in the city of Atlanta and other places. But what gets me about this particular case, and I've said this to everyone I've discussed this case with, regardless of whether or not you believe that this officer's actions were justified, you cannot be okay with the removal of constitutional rights and the complete disregard for due process that this officer received. Within 24 hours, he was terminated by the chief of police. Chief Erica Shields terminated him and then herself resigned. And the public found out about this officer's termination when the mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, announced at 5 o'clock the next day after this incident that this officer had been fired. And then 5 days later, the Fulton County District Attorney, Paul Howard, charged this officer with murder. Now, keep in mind, this is before the officer ever made his statement. There had not been any kind of interview with him by his own agency. There was not a hint of due process. And the Georgia Bureau of Investigation hadn't even got their investigation off the ground yet, let alone been able to form some sort of professional opinion about it. Within 5 days of this happening, this officer was fired and charged with murder. Where is the due process? It's gone. Where are his constitutional rights? They're gone. And now, I'm not the attorney, but correct me if I'm wrong, that due process of law is the only right we have that's stated twice in the Bill of Rights. It is that important. And again, regardless of, and this case is still not, unless I've missed it in the last little while, this case is still not disposed of. And this officer, up until a few months ago, was still having to abide by the conditions of his pretrial release, which was an ankle monitor and a curfew. Now, he was basically the Civil Service Commission of Atlanta had already determined that he was released without due process. The officer, supervisor rather, who signed his termination documents came and said at the civil service hearing that he knew something was wrong with all of this. I mean, this whole case doesn't pass the smell test at all. And then it came out in the news later that the prosecutor's office withheld exculpatory evidence, and even it was alleged that the prosecutor's office even lied in order to get the indictment. This is the kind of thing that's going on against police officers. Now, if that happens to a citizen, we have the right to. We are innocent until proven guilty. That is how our criminal justice system works. That is, the presumption of innocence is important in our criminal justice system. If that goes away, we have a real problem. I'm sure you would agree with that as a former federal prosecutor. Now, are we jaded sometimes? Yes. Do we come to our own conclusions and draw our own opinions sometimes? Yes, that does happen, but we all still have that presumption of innocence, and that was taken from Officer Rolfe in this case. If that were to happen to you and I, we would be outraged. But for it to happen to a police officer, and again later it was admitted by the new chief of police, whose name escapes my memory, but he even alluded to, I won't say admitted, but he alluded to the fact that particular dismissal and indictment may have been just to kind of appease. In other words, he was a political sacrificial lamb. I'm not explaining it like I'd want to, but he was a political sacrificial lamb. I think everybody understands that. And we can't, just as police officers cannot go out and trample on the civil rights of the citizens, the government can't do that to police officers either. One is not any better than the other. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you wholeheartedly, and unfortunately we see too much of that happening, where it's the rush to judgment, if you will, and that then brings us back full circle to what I said when we were off camera and what I've said, hinted at here. But what we need a better coordination of how we handle these situations. It appears to me that many times the civil suit is filed, and then the local community goes and pays off the civil suit, and all of a sudden you immediately think the officer must be guilty of something.
Exactly.
You're going to see another example of this coming up down the road, but the officer, Brett Hankinson, who was the officer that fired through the window that was then charged in the Breonna Taylor case, he recently was found not guilty. The jury had the case for about 3 hours, and they found not guilty. He spent thousands of dollars to defend that case, and it was the rush to judgment. We came up the next morning and said, what happened here was terrible, we're going to indict everybody. When you get ready to do your next book, I would really suggest, and I know you'll do another book, but I think there's a big difference in the distinction in law enforcement in the major cities and in rural America. I think that the mindset in rural America, and I do a lot of volunteer work out in eastern Kentucky, and I can tell you the mindset of people out there is if the officer tells you to do something, then do it. Don't raise it up to the level of confrontation. And, if you haven't done anything wrong, or even if you've done something wrong, you don't need to bring it to that level.
Correct.
But again, like I said, I think we're very fortunate here in Lexington. We've got a wonderful police chief. He's been on the streets. He's done a lot. He handled the community outrage here in Lexington much differently than they did in Louisville. He actually went out and marched and made sure that everything was good for his officers. Our mayor was very supportive of both the police officers and the concerns of the citizenry. We've got a wonderful Commonwealth attorney here that doesn't rush to judgment. You'd never see Luana Redcorn rush to judgment. She's part of the process. And then we have a faith-based community that works closely with the police department and the mayor in making sure these things don't happen. And so We don't have that in the major cities. We have people just pouring gasoline on the fire. And so what happened to the officer in Atlanta was outrageous. Should have never happened. But the one thing that you have to keep in mind, and one thing that I used to use the saying all the time is, before you pull the trigger, remember, you can't unring the bell. And once you tell somebody that somebody's done something wrong, or once you issue an indictment, you cannot withdraw with the harm that you've done to that person's life. So
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, this continues to happen. It has happened in so many places in which officers are cleared by grand juries. They're cleared, obviously, by their internal investigations, and then a prosecutor will turn around and charge them anyway in some of these fatal uses of force. And I don't understand. Maybe you can help me understand in another conversation. I know we can't talk about everything in the short time we have, but I don't understand how prosecutors can become activists in these major cities, and how do you get prosecutors that don't like the police and are looking to, put cops behind bars? I guess it's maybe the political aspect of it. Unfortunately, prosecutors are politicians too, county prosecutors, that is. But I don't see an end to this, Mark, and that's kind of the final thought I want you to help me with. Where is the end to this? What happens to bring to an end this frivolous and unjust prosecution of police officers whose civil rights have been taken away, whose due process has been robbed of them? Because what's going to happen is police officers are going to stop working. They're going to get in the tall grass, and they're not going to be proactive anymore. We've seen this over and over and over and over and over. It's been called the Ferguson effect. When you attack police officers, not just physically, but politically and personally, and you put them in fear, not of their safety. We all knew when we signed up that there was a chance we wouldn't come home at night, but we didn't sign up for our lives to be destroyed. We didn't sign up for our homes to be taken, in the absence of qualified immunity when we've acted in good faith. We didn't sign up for all of that. And so what I see and what is borne out by the stats across the country is that police officers are less proactive. And I see that continuing unless something turns the Titanic here.
Well, I agree, especially in the major cities. But I think what I see happening, again, talking about rural America, there's a couple of high schools out in eastern Kentucky right now that have started law enforcement training for kids in high school. They've hired in officers that are either retired or been out there in the streets and so forth. And I see kids today, and I shouldn't say, well, I guess I can. At my age, I can say kids today. I see them looking at law enforcement in a different light than what maybe even what you and I looked at when we were out there in the streets. I see them as thinking that it's a job that is a necessary job, and they respect the community, and there's more of an idea of community type policing and so forth. So I think we're going to see a shift, but I don't think the shift's going to come in the major cities. I think it's too late for New York and Seattle and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Chicago, and some of the other cities. I don't know what's going to turn them around, but I can tell you right now, and you have these same conversations I have with my friends, is if I had to have my son come to me and say, Dad, would you recommend a career in law enforcement? Sadly, I tell him, maybe yes, but maybe no, but not certainly in one of those big cities. And those big cities are not going to be able to fill the needs. I mean, look at Seattle right now. They're trying to hire people in. People aren't going to go into Seattle. Why risk it?
Nope. Well, my son and my son-in-law both have expressed the interest, and have for some time, in going into the police profession. And I respect their opinions, but I also ask them to listen to the old man's view and learn from some wisdom that I have. It's not like it was when I started. It's certainly not like it was when you started. It's just policing will never be the same in the country. And that's unfortunate. I do want to end this time together, this discussion. It's been a very riveting discussion. You've taught me some things by kind of a closing paragraph from this column that got my attention, that got us acquainted. This is how you ended it. You said, "So, as I often do, I will ask all Americans to join me on my imaginary mountaintop as we shout loudly to the so-called political leaders who have allowed criminals responsible for violent protests and riots that enough is enough. It is time to shout even louder to America's police officers and their families that Americans respect and support them. Beautiful end to a column, beautiful end to this particular episode of the podcast. That's why I wrote Blue Lies, is because now that I've walked away from law enforcement, I have the ability to say what I want to say and to stand up for America's police officers. As I have said many times, I am not a social media celebrity. I don't have a mass following. I'm not an influencer. I am just a beat cop from the suburbs of Cincinnati who's using my voice to speak out and have these conversations with folks like you that can give me even greater insight to that. And I do believe, as you said, enough is enough. And more than telling America about these blue lies that we are made to believe, it is important for us to tell police officers we stand behind you, we're with you, and we're always going to have your back as long as you do the right thing.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. It was very nice getting together with you today.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time. I know you're busy. You filled up your retirement with many worthy endeavors, and I wish you all the best. Godspeed, God bless you, and stay safe.
Thank you. Same to you, my friend.
I hope you have been informed and educated by our conversation today. If you want to know more, the truth is uncovered in my Amazon bestseller, Blue Lies: The War on Justice and the Conspiracy to Weaken America's Cops. Get it on Amazon or at blueliesbook.com. Let our heroes know that you back the blue, and stay safe. Remember, a police officer fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves who stands behind him.